A fisherman went out for his usual catch, but the net pulled up something other than fish. What he found inside made his heart stop and changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning had settled over the small American town in its usual quiet rhythm, a rhythm that had defined the life of George for many years. The river, broad and calm, breathed out a mist that clung low to its banks, while the sun still hesitated behind a veil of pale gray clouds. George guided his wooden boat through the familiar current, the oars cutting gently into the surface, leaving ripples that spread and vanished as if the water itself wished to remain undisturbed. For him, mornings like this were not merely routines, but lifelines. Since the day his wife had been taken by illness and his children had drifted away into lives of their own in distant states, the river had become his constant companion. Its steady presence offered him a silence that did not mock him, a solitude that did not wound but embraced. He often told himself that the river had known him longer than anyone alive now, and perhaps, in its own way, it understood him. He had been fishing since boyhood, when his father first pressed the rough wooden handle of a rod into his hand and told him that patience was a fisherman's greatest tool. George had grown into a man, served his time in labor and hardship, raised a family, and then watched that family scatter, as rivers tend to scatter streams away from their source. Yet the habit of fishing remained. It was not just about the promise of a catch. It was the ritual of it, the launch at dawn, the feel of damp air in his lungs, the soft lap of water against the hull. To fish was to remind himself that he was still alive, and still part of something larger than himself. That morning began like so many others. He had rowed to a quiet bend of the river, a spot known for its depth and the shelter it gave to fish, a place he trusted to offer him enough for the day. With practiced ease, he unfolded his net and let it sink into the dark water. The splash was small, quickly swallowed by the stillness. He sat back and waited, letting the time pass with the patience of a man who had long ago learned that nothing worthwhile could be hurried. His mind wandered to thoughts of his grandchildren, whom he saw only on rare visits. He imagined buying them sweets from the little store near the square, imagined their delighted laughter. The thought warmed him against the loneliness he carried with him like an invisible coat. It was as he pulled on the net some time later that his morning ceased to be ordinary. At first he thought he had caught a large branch or a cluster of rocks, for the weight was far greater than he expected. His arms strained against it, the muscles of his back pulling tight, and for a moment he worried the net might tear. The water resisted, reluctant to give up what it held. His breath grew heavy, and his hands, hardened by years of work, shook with the effort. The current lapped harder against the side of the boat, as if the river itself was holding on. When finally the object broke the surface, his eyes widened. Tangled in the mesh was no fish at all, nor any log. It was a shape he recognized only after a stunned pause. A camera, the old kind made of heavy metal, coated now in rust, in layers of river silt. Its leather strap dangled limply, half eaten away, and strands of green weeds clung to it like hair. It looked as though it had slept at the bottom of the river for decades, forgotten by all. George stared, unable to move for a moment. It was such an absurd sight, so unexpected, that he felt his heartbeat echo in his ears. He pulled it closer and set it in the bottom of his boat. Water ran from its seams, leaving small puddles at his feet. He crouched down and studied it, his fingers tracing the rough corrosion. For a moment he considered throwing it back, dismissing it as nothing more than junk. But something in him hesitated. Objects lost to rivers often carried stories, and he could not shake the feeling that this one did too. Why had it been there? Who had lost it? His mind stirred with quiet curiosity, an ember of interest he had not felt in years. He remembered the afternoons when his late wife would take photographs with a simple Kodak, capturing birthdays, fishing trips, moments of laughter in their backyard. Looking at this ruined camera brought back the sound of the shutter, the flash of light, the small, frozen memories pressed into paper. What photographs had this old machine once taken? And more importantly, had any of them survived? As his boat drifted on the slow current, George weighed his options. It would be simple to toss the thing back into the water, forget it ever appeared, and focus on his nets. But he could not. Something about the find gripped him, tugging at him with a persistence he did not understand. He imagined himself bringing it into town to someone who might know what to do with it. There was a man he knew, Henry, who kept a small workshop near the edge of Main Street. Henry had a fondness for old machines, radios, typewriters, even gramophones, and he had once repaired an antique clock George had inherited from his father. If anyone could look at this ruined camera and see if it still contained something worth saving, it would be him. With that decision forming in his mind, George continued his fishing, though his focus was broken. The thought of what lay inside that camera occupied him more than the fish that tugged weakly at his lines. He imagined faded photographs of families he had never met, strangers frozen in time. He wondered if the faces would be smiling, if the scenes would be ordinary or extraordinary. Each speculation only deepened his resolve to keep the camera. By the time he rowed back to the dock, his catch was modest, but he hardly noticed. His attention remained fixed on the battered device sitting in the corner of the boat, dripping and silent like a secret waiting to be spoken. As he tied up his boat and carried his gear ashore, George felt a strange anticipation. It was as though the river had handed him not just an object, but a responsibility. He walked slowly through the quiet streets of town, the morning still young, the air carrying the scent of dew and freshly baked bread from the bakery. He passed familiar houses, waved absently to a neighbor, but all the while his mind was fixed on the camera, heavy in his bag. At Henry's workshop, the windows were still dark. George stood outside for a moment, listening to the distant hum of a truck on the highway, before deciding to return later in the day when the shop would be open. Back in his home, he set the camera on the kitchen table. The sight of it there, under the dim light that filtered through the curtains, gave him a strange unease. He sat across from it with a cup of coffee, staring as though it might reveal its story without his asking. He felt the same pull he had felt in the boat, the certainty that it had been meant for him to find. Yet he could not explain why he felt so strongly. It was only a camera, ruined by water and time. And yet it was not. It was a vessel of memory, a container of lives once lived. If the film inside had survived, then somewhere within those corroded walls were frozen fragments of the past, waiting for light to bring them forth again. George finished his coffee and sighed. His hands, though aged, were steady now. Tomorrow he decided he would bring it to Henry and see what might be done. Tonight he would leave it as it was, resting quietly in his house like a guest he did not yet know how to greet. For the first time in many years, he felt a stir of something close to excitement, and with that stir came the faintest spark of purpose. The river had offered him a gift, though he did not yet know its meaning. What he did know was that his life, once so predictable, had shifted. Somewhere in the rusted shell of that camera lay a story, and he had been chosen, by chance or fate, to be the one to uncover it. And as evening fell and the sounds of the town quieted into dusk, George sat alone with the silence of his home, the camera's presence filling the room with questions. He did not yet realize that this ordinary morning on the river had set into motion something that would reach beyond his solitude, something that would connect the forgotten past to the present. Tomorrow, with the camera in hand, he would take the first step into that story. The night after George had pulled the strange object from the river was uneasy. He slept, but it was a shallow kind of rest, the kind in which thoughts wander restlessly through the corridors of the mind and circle back on themselves again and again. Every time he woke, turning on his old mattress, his eyes wandered toward the kitchen table where the camera sat, still damp in places, as though the river had only just released it. He had placed a cloth under it to keep the water from staining the wood, but the marks were there anyway, faint rings that seemed to remind him each time he glanced at them that this was no ordinary thing he had found. By dawn, when the first slant of light filtered through the curtains, he had already decided he could not bear to leave the mystery unopened any longer. He would take it to Henry that morning, come what may. The town was stirring when George left his house, the camera wrapped carefully in an old towel and carried in his fishing bag as though it were a fragile animal. He walked the familiar streets, past porches where neighbors sipped their first cups of coffee, past the bakery where the scent of fresh bread made his stomach growl, past the newsstand where the local paper carried yet another small headline about the declining industry in the region. All of it seemed distant to him, muffled by the quiet excitement thrumming in his chest. He walked with the certainty of a man who was following something larger than himself, though he could not yet name what it was. Henry's shop stood near the end of Main Street, its front window cluttered with relics from half a century ago. Old radios sat beside phonographs, rusted typewriters leaned against stacks of vinyl records, and in the center was a clock whose hands had stopped at a time no one could quite remember. Inside, the air smelled of oil and dust, the peculiar fragrance of machines that had been coaxed into giving up their secrets by steady hands. When George entered, Henry looked up from the workbench, his spectacles sliding down his nose. He was a man of indeterminate age, perhaps younger than George, but with a stoop that made him seem older, his fingers stained from years of tinkering. "What have you got there?" Henry asked, pushing his tools aside. George unwrapped the towel and placed the camera on the bench. For a long moment, Henry said nothing. He bent close, adjusted his glasses, and touched the corroded metal with reverence, as though he were examining the bones of something rare. "This is old," he murmured, turning it carefully. "Mid-century, maybe late 60s. Heavy model. It must have been underwater for decades." He tried the shutter, which stuck and refused to budge. Then after a pause, he lifted the back panel with slow precision. A small sound escaped him. "Well, I'll be damned. The film is still inside." George felt a tightening in his chest, a mix of anticipation and disbelief. "Is it ruined?" he asked. Henry did not answer at once. He leaned back, scratching his chin. "It may be, but film can surprise you. Sometimes, even after years in the worst conditions, something remains. The emulsion holds on, even when you think it's gone. If you're lucky, some of the images may still be there." He looked up at George, his eyes bright now with a curiosity to match his own. "Do you want me to try?" George nodded without hesitation. He had not known until that moment how badly he wanted to see whatever lay hidden on that strip of celluloid. The process was delicate, and Henry insisted George stay while he worked. They moved into the back of the shop where the red light of the darkroom glowed faintly through the cracks in the door. The air inside was thick with the smell of chemicals, acrid but strangely comforting, like stepping back into another time. Henry's hands moved with the practiced ease of long habit, unwinding the brittle film, guiding it carefully through the baths of developer and fixer. George stood aside, his heart pounding with each turn of the reel. It felt like watching a ritual, as though they were calling ghosts from the shadows of water and time. And then, slowly, the images began to appear. At first they were vague shapes, shadows on the paper. Then faces, blurred but recognizable. A man, tall and square-shouldered, smiling at the camera. A woman, her hair swept back in the style of another era, holding the hand of a small boy. A girl, younger still, clutching a doll to her chest. The family posed together in a yard that looked like any number of houses in town, the sunlight falling across them in pale streaks. George felt a strange pull in his chest as he leaned closer. He did not know them, not really, but something about their expressions, the quiet joy, the ordinary warmth spoke to him across the years. Photograph after photograph revealed itself, each one a fragment of a lifelong past. The family at a picnic table, plates of food before them. The children running across a field, the boy's hair flying behind him. The woman seated on the porch steps, her eyes turned not to the camera, but to the man beside her, her expression one of unspoken devotion. These were not stage portraits, but slices of real life, caught and preserved by the click of a shutter 50 years before. George could hardly breathe as he watched them emerge, each more vivid than the last. And then came something that made his breath hitch. In several of the photographs, and standing a little apart from the family, half in shadow or blurred by movement, was another figure. A young man, lean and serious, his face turned partly away. George's eyes widened as recognition dawned. Though the years had passed, he knew that face. It was Thomas Hale. The name rushed back to him with the weight of forgotten history. Thomas had been a young man of the town, known to all, who had vanished one summer and was never seen again. George had been a teenager at the time, and he remembered the stir it caused, the search parties, the whispered rumors, the endless questions that never found answers. The mystery had become part of the town's lore, something spoken of in hushed tones by older folk, a story children heard and half believed. To see Thomas now captured in these forgotten frames was like seeing a ghost, though George did not believe in ghosts. It was something more solid, more troubling. These pictures were evidence, proof that he had been there, in those days leading up to his disappearance. In one photograph, Thomas stood at the edge of a dock, the family behind him, their smiles oblivious to his presence. In another, he leaned against a car, his eyes downcast. Each image seemed a whisper of something unsaid, a connection not yet understood. George felt a heaviness settle in him as the last of the images dried on the line. He turned to Henry, whose expression had shifted from curiosity to a kind of quiet unease. "You know who that is, don't you?" Henry asked softly. George nodded. "Thomas Hale," he said, his voice almost a whisper, as though speaking the name might disturb the silence of the room. The sound of it carried with it the weight of 50 years, the echo of questions never answered. Henry said nothing more, only glanced at the photographs again, his lips pressed into a thin line. As they left the dark room, George felt as though the world outside had shifted. The sunlight spilling through the shop windows was the same, the street outside unchanged, but within him something had altered. He carried the photographs carefully, his fingers trembling as though he held not paper but fragments of lives torn away and returned. He thought of the family in the pictures, their smiles preserved against time, their innocence untouched by what he now suspected might be tragedy. He thought of Thomas Hale, a young man who had walked the same streets he walked, who had stood on the same riverbanks, who had vanished without leaving a trace, and now, after half a century, here he was again, silent but undeniable, staring back at them from the grainy edges of photographs pulled from the river. That night, George sat at his table once more, the photographs spread before him. He studied each one carefully, as though searching for clues in the tilt of a head, the shadow of a building, the background of a scene. His mind returned again and again to Thomas's face. Why was he there? What was his connection to that family? And most of all, why had these images been lost to the river, only to be found now in his hands? The questions circled like restless birds, and for the first time in many years, George felt not the emptiness of solitude, but the sharp tug of purpose. He understood, even if only dimly, that he could not ignore what he had seen. The river had delivered not just a relic, but a story, and it was up to him to discover what that story meant. As the clock ticked on into the late hours, George leaned back, exhaustion pulling at him, but his mind refused to rest. He thought of the search parties all those years ago, the headlines, the hushed voices of his parents when they thought he was not listening. He remembered the way Thomas's name had been spoken, with pity, with confusion, with fear. And now here were photographs that placed him in the days before his disappearance, photographs no one had ever seen. George closed his eyes, the images still burning behind them. He knew without question that his life had changed course. The river had given him more than he asked for. It had given him a key, and he could not help but wonder what locked door it might open. The days that followed were unlike any George had known in years. Where once his mornings had been governed by the quiet ritual of fishing, selling his modest catch, and returning to the silence of his home, now they were filled with a restless energy he could neither ignore nor explain away. The photographs lay spread across his kitchen table as though they were living things, demanding attention each time he passed. He found himself drawn to them, studying the faces, the gestures, the details of the backgrounds with the kind of concentration that belonged more to a detective than to a fisherman. The presence of Thomas Hale in those images weighed heavily upon him. It was not merely curiosity that held him. It was a sense of obligation, a feeling that the river had placed in his hands not just a set of old pictures, but a responsibility to listen to the story they tried to tell. When he finally resolved to show the photographs to others, it was with a kind of nervous dread, as though he were tampering with something long buried. The town had not spoken openly about Thomas Hale in decades. To bring up his name was to stir a memory many preferred to leave undisturbed. But George could not help himself. One afternoon he carried a small stack of the clearest images with him as he walked into the town square. He began with the barber, a man older than himself whose shop had been a fixture for as long as George could remember. When he laid the photographs on the counter, the barber's eyes widened at once. He leaned closer, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "I'll be," the barber whispered, his voice brittle. "That's Tom. I haven't seen his face since I was a young man." His eyes darted nervously toward the window, as if afraid someone might overhear. "Where did you find these?" George explained as simply as he could, leaving out the details that might invite disbelief. The barber nodded, his expression clouded. "He was a good boy, Tom. Kept to himself, worked hard. But there were whispers, you know. Folks said he'd seen something he wasn't meant to see. Others said he just up and left, ran away to the city. But I never believed that. He wasn't the kind to walk away without a word." He pushed the photographs back toward George, his fingers lingering as if reluctant to let them go. "I don't know what this means, but it gives me a chill to see him again." Encouraged, George carried the pictures to others' old neighbors, a retired teacher, the grocer whose memory stretched further than most. Each reaction was similar: shock, sorrow, unease. Some turned away quickly, unwilling to dwell on the past. Others studied the images with haunted eyes, recalling details long forgotten. A retired dock worker spoke of seeing Tom the very night before he vanished, standing near the pier with a look of deep worry on his face. Another remembered the car in the background of one photograph, a sleek black sedan that had belonged to Richard Collins, the wealthy businessman whose influence over the town had been absolute in those days. Collins's name stirred unease even now, though he had been dead for many years. The more George listened, the more the photographs revealed themselves to be more than simple family mementos. They were fragments of a puzzle, each detail hinting at connections unseen. The motel sign in one image reminded an elderly woman of the travelers who came and went during that summer, some of whom she swore were not honest men. The boarded-up bar in another photograph had been a gathering place for powerful figures, men who were known to keep secrets and silence those who threatened them. And always, in the edges of the frames, there was Thomas, never the focus, never smiling, but always present, as though fate itself had placed him there. George found himself spending hours at the local library, combing through old newspapers, yellowed with age. He sat at a wooden table beneath the flickering lights, the silence broken only by the turning of brittle pages. The headlines told the story as he remembered it. Local man missing after fishing trip. Search for Thomas Hale yields no clues. Rumors swirl around disappearance. The articles spoke of search parties that combed the riverbanks, of interviews with friends and acquaintances, of the unanswered questions that hung over the town. Yet nowhere was there mention of the family in the photographs, nor of their connection to Tom. It was late one evening, as George lingered over a stack of clippings, that an elderly librarian approached. She had been watching him for some time, her curiosity piqued by his persistence. "You're looking into Tom Hale, aren't you?" she said softly. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had lived through the events herself. "I remember that summer. My father was on the search committee. People were scared, not just because Tom was gone, but because of what it meant. We all knew there were things happening in town we weren't supposed to talk about. Deals being made, money changing hands. Tom, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's what people whispered." George showed her one of the photographs, the one where Tom stood near the black car. Her face paled as she recognized it. "Collins," she murmured. "That was his car. Everyone knew it. Sleekest machine in town. If Tom was near that, then—" She trailed off, unwilling to finish, but her silence said enough. George left the library that night with a heaviness pressing down on him. The pieces were beginning to fit, though the picture they formed was far from clear. At home, he spread the photographs across his table once again. He studied the smiles of the family, the innocent joy of the children, the devotion in the woman's eyes, and then the shadowed presence of Tom, standing apart. The contrast was stark and the implications troubling. What was his connection to them? Why had he been captured in their moments of happiness? And why had those photographs been hidden away in a camera, that slept beneath the river for 50 years. The questions refused to let him rest. In his dreams, he saw the figures from the photographs moving, speaking, reaching for something beyond his grasp. He woke with the taste of river water on his tongue, his heart pounding with the urgency of discovery. The town might wish to forget, but George could not. Each conversation, each memory stirred by the photographs only deepened his conviction that he had been placed on a path he could not abandon. He was not merely a fisherman anymore. He was a witness, perhaps the last chance for the truth to surface. As the week drew to a close, George resolved to press further. The whispers of the townsfolk, the old clippings, the details captured by the camera all pointed toward a web of secrets that had been carefully buried. Thomas Hale had not simply vanished into the night. Something had happened, something deliberate, something dark, and the photographs pulled from the river's depths had been given to him for a reason. He could not yet name that reason, but he knew he would follow it wherever it led. The echoes of long ago had begun to speak, and George, weary fisherman though he was, had no choice but to listen. The story was no longer only about a man lost to time. It was about a town, about the silence it had chosen, and about the truth waiting, patient and insistent, to be found at last. And as George gathered the photographs into their worn envelope and set them aside for the night, he understood that the past was no longer past at all. It was alive, restless, and pulling him deeper into its current, just as the river had done on the morning when it gave him the camera. The days of uneasy curiosity had turned into a steady determination that George could not shake. The echoes of those he had spoken to, their hesitant words and unfinished sentences, stayed with him long after he had returned home each night. The photographs, spread across his table or carefully tucked away in the envelope Henry had given him, had become something more than simple images. They were voices. They spoke of lives once lived, of a moment in time that had been captured, and of a man who had walked into shadow and never returned. George no longer saw himself as a bystander in this story. He had become part of it, a reluctant custodian of fragments that begged to be joined together. The river had placed the burden in his hands, and though he did not know why, he felt powerless to lay it down. It was with this weight upon him that he found himself in the library again, the smell of old paper and dust rising as he leafed through brittle archives. The librarian, who had once confessed her father's involvement in the search for Thomas Hale, watched him quietly now, as though she recognized that his presence there was not the idle curiosity of an old man, but something deeper. He returned to the newspapers of that summer when Tom had disappeared, his eyes scanning headlines and columns that seemed almost alive in their urgency, despite the faded ink. Each line carried the anxiety of a community that had searched and failed, that had whispered and speculated, but never found peace. He read about the volunteers who had walked the riverbanks, lanterns in their hands, calling Tom's name into the night. He read about the boats that had dragged the water, pulling up nothing but mud and debris. He saw the names of those questioned, friends, co-workers, the owner of the bar where Tom was last seen, and he saw again and again the mention of Richard Collins, never in direct connection, but always at the periphery, as though the reporters themselves had sensed the shadow, but dared not speak its name. Collins, the wealthy businessman, the man whose company had employed half the town, whose donations had kept schools open and politicians loyal. He had been untouchable in those days, a man who moved with a confidence born of power. The more George read, the more certain he became that Collins was not just a background figure in Tom's story. The black car in the photograph had been no coincidence. Others had recognized it instantly. That car had been seen near the dock, near the motel, even near the bar where Tom was said to have spent his last evening. It was as though Collins's presence hovered just beyond the frame of every account, invisible yet undeniable. George left the library late, his hands stained with newsprint, his mind buzzing with connections. He walked slowly through the streets of town, past buildings that had stood silent, witness to all of it. The bar was gone now, replaced by a laundromat, its bright lights hiding the fact that once men had gathered there in smoke and secrecy. The motel had long been abandoned, its paint peeling, its windows dark. He stood outside it for a long time, the photographs in his pocket, staring at the empty facade and imagining it as it once had been. Travelers arriving, deals whispered behind closed doors, and somewhere among it all, a young man named Thomas who had seen something he was not supposed to. The next day he sought out those who might remember more. An old woman who had once worked as a waitress at the bar told him in a hushed voice that she had seen Tom there on the night he vanished. She remembered him arguing quietly with Collins, though she had never dared to tell the police. He was afraid, she whispered, her eyes darting to the door as though someone might overhear. I could see it in the way he looked around. He wanted to leave, but Collins wouldn't let him. And then he was gone. She shook her head, her lips trembling. We all knew, but we didn't say. Who could stand against a man like Collins? Piece by piece, the puzzle was forming. George carried each fragment home, placing it carefully in his mind alongside the photographs. The family, so joyful and ordinary, had somehow been tied to Thomas, and through him, to the shadows cast by Collins. Perhaps they had been friends, perhaps witnesses themselves. The photographs might not have been lost by chance. They might have been hidden, thrown into the river to bury not just memories but evidence. It was Henry, ever patient in his curiosity, who suggested they look closer at the photographs themselves. One evening they spread them across the workbench in the back of his shop, studying every corner with a magnifying glass. Details emerged that George had not noticed before. A clock on the wall of the bar, its hands frozen at a specific hour, a sign in the background of the motel photograph advertising a room rate that placed the date squarely in the summer Tom vanished, a faint reflection in the car window that hinted at another man standing just out of frame. Each discovery added weight to the theory forming in George's mind. Tom had not disappeared because he wandered too close to the river. He had vanished because he had been caught in something larger, something dangerous, something orchestrated. The responsibility of it grew heavier with each revelation. At times George wondered if he was foolish, an old man chasing shadows while the world moved on without him. Yet the faces of the family in the photographs, the innocence of the children, the quiet love between husband and wife, reminded him that these were not abstractions. These were real people, and their lives had intersected with Tom's in a way that had ended in silence and loss. He could not walk away from that. To do so would be to betray not just Tom, but the truth itself. And so he pressed on, speaking to more townsfolk, gathering more memories. Each person gave him a sliver of the past, hesitant but undeniable. Some spoke of Collins's influence, of deals made and threats whispered. Others recalled Tom's character, his honesty, his unwillingness to bow to men who thought themselves above the law. Together, these fragments painted a picture of a man who had stood in the wrong place at the wrong time, who had seen too much, and who had paid the price for it. Late one night, as George sat once more at his table, the photographs before him, he felt the weight of what he had uncovered. The river had given him not just relics but evidence, and with it a choice. He could keep it to himself, preserving the quiet of his life, or he could follow the traces further, wherever they led, even if it meant stirring the silence the town had chosen for half a century. He looked again at Tom's face in the grainy photograph. The solemn eyes turned toward a world that had betrayed him, and he knew the choice had already been made. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows of memory and the silence of the past, and George would not rest until he found it. The traces were leading him forward, and though he did not know the destination, he felt in his bones that he was closer now than ever before. The story was no longer just about a fisherman and a forgotten camera. It was about justice long delayed, and the possibility, however faint, that it might still be found. George had not intended to let the photographs leave the quiet circle of his own kitchen table and Henry's dimly lit workshop. But truth, once uncovered, has a way of pushing outward, demanding air, refusing to be hidden again. The fragments he had gathered, the whispers of those too frightened to speak fully, the old headlines and the unmistakable presence of Thomas Hale in the images, were no longer secrets he could shoulder alone. He felt both weary and compelled, like a man rowing against a current too strong to fight, yet knowing that to stop rowing meant surrender. When Henry urged him to allow others to see the evidence, George hesitated, his heart filled with dread for what might follow. Yet deep down he understood that silence had protected shadows long enough. It was time for those shadows to be illuminated. The local newspaper, a modest weekly that most townsfolk read more out of habit than hunger for news, became the unexpected stage for what followed. George brought the photographs to a young journalist named Claire, who had moved to the town only a few years before. Unlike the older residents, who carried the burden of Colin's power even into the present day, Claire had no memory of his influence and no instinct to lower her voice when his name was spoken. She listened intently as George explained the discovery, the river's gift, the development of the film, the figures in the background. When she studied the photographs herself, her eyes widened not with fear but with determination. "This is history," she said, her voice steady, "and it's also justice. People deserve to know." George felt a pang of unease at her certainty. For him, the pursuit of truth had been a heavy personal mission, an obligation tied to the memory of a man lost. For her, it was a story, something to be written, printed, shared. Yet he could not deny she was right. The truth belonged not only to him, but to everyone who had lived in the shadow of what had happened. The article appeared in the following week's edition. The headline, bold across the top, read, "Forgotten Photographs Resurface, New Clues in the Hale Disappearance." Below it were the images themselves, grainy but unmistakable. Thomas Hale standing apart, always watching. The text beneath wove together the threads George had traced. The family captured in moments of joy. The black car linked to Colin's. The memories of townsfolk who remembered Tom's last days. The impact was immediate. In diners and grocery stores, in church halls and on front porches, people whispered the name of Thomas Hale once more. Men and women who had been young in that summer long past found themselves transported back to a time of unease, to the feeling that something had been stolen from them when Tom vanished and was never spoken of again. For the younger generation, the article was a revelation. They had grown up with fragments of the story, half-told warnings from parents and grandparents, but now they saw faces, details, connections. With the whispers came courage. Those who had been silent for decades began to speak, not loudly, but with the relief of finally unburdening themselves. An old mechanic recalled repairing Collins's black car on the very week Tom disappeared, noticing a dent in the bumper that was never explained. A former deputy, long retired, confessed that the official investigation had been quietly curtailed, orders passed down to stop pressing questions. "We all knew something wasn't right," he admitted to George one evening, his hands shaking as he held his coffee cup. But Collins had the kind of reach that went far beyond this town. If he wanted silence, silence was what he got. The story might have remained abstract, a web of memories and photographs, if not for the reappearance of a living link to Tom himself. George learned through Claire's research that Tom had a younger sister, Margaret, who still lived in the county, though she had moved to a quieter town many years earlier. She was an elderly woman now, frail but sharp-eyed, and when Claire contacted her with news of the photographs, she agreed reluctantly to meet. George accompanied the journalist on the day of the visit, feeling both apprehension and sorrow as he carried the envelope of photographs in his hands. Margaret lived in a modest house at the end of a tree-lined road, her garden neat though clearly tended by hired help. She welcomed them with politeness, but also with the guarded air of someone long accustomed to disappointment. When George laid the photographs before her, her composure cracked. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, and she reached out with trembling fingers to touch the images. "That's him," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "That's my brother. I haven't seen his face in 50 years, and now here he is again." She studied each photograph slowly, as though memorizing them, her tears falling onto the table. "We never knew what happened. We searched, we prayed, but all we were told was that he was gone, lost. My mother died, still waiting for an answer. And now," she pressed a hand to her mouth, her voice breaking, "now he's here again, caught in these moments." She recognized others in the photographs too. The family in the images, she explained, had been friends of Tom's. The woman had worked alongside her mother at the factory, and Tom had often looked after the children when their parents were busy. "He loved those kids," Margaret said, her voice thick with memory. "He always had a way with children. That's why it doesn't surprise me to see him near them." But it frightens me too, because it means he was with them in those days just before. She trailed off, unable to continue. For Margaret, the photographs were both a gift and a wound. They returned to her a brother she had lost, but they also sharpened the pain of not knowing his fate. George felt her grief like a weight upon his own shoulders. He had set something in motion that could no longer be contained. The truth, once whispered, demanded to be spoken aloud. The choice now lay before them. They could let the photographs remain as they were, fragments of a mystery that hinted at answers but offered none. Or they could press further, seeking testimony, demanding acknowledgement, ensuring that the silence imposed by Colin's shadow did not endure unbroken. Margaret surprised George by being the one to insist. "I have lived with questions my entire life," she said firmly, her tears drying into determination. "If there is even the chance of answers, I will not turn away. I owe that to Tom." Her resolve reignited George's own. Together with Claire, they began to gather more accounts, speaking to those who had already shown hints of knowledge. Some remained fearful, their eyes shifting as though the ghost of Colin still walked among them. Others, emboldened by the newspaper story, spoke more freely. The web of silence that had protected the truth was unraveling, thread by thread. George knew there would be no simple resolution. The men who might have been most responsible were long gone, their power buried with them. But the truth was not about punishment now. It was about recognition, about giving voice to what had been stolen. For Margaret, for the town, and even for himself, it was about closing a chapter that had been left open far too long. And so George found himself once more at his kitchen table late into the night. The photographs spread out like pieces of a puzzle that had at last begun to show their picture. The family's joy, Tom's solemn presence, the black car lurking in the background, they were no longer isolated fragments but part of a larger story. The town was listening now. The silence had been broken. And though the journey ahead promised no easy peace, George felt something he had not felt in years, the certainty that he was no longer alone, that others shared the burden, and that together they would carry it toward the light of truth. The unmasking of the past had begun, and there would be no turning back. The town had always carried the weight of Thomas Hale's disappearance like a scar that people covered with long sleeves. It was there beneath the skin of conversations, under the layers of progress and decay, a reminder of something unresolved that had been passed from one generation to the next. Now with the photographs uncovered, the silence that had blanketed those memories for half a century was torn away. George had not intended to become the man to tear it, but once it happened, there was no repairing it, no returning to the muted safety of forgetting. The truth, in its own patient way, had risen, and it demanded to be spoken. Claire's articles did not stop with the first one. Encouraged by the response of the townsfolk, she published follow-ups, each building upon the last. She wrote about Margaret's testimony, about the fragments of recollection gathered from townspeople, about the way the photographs tied together details that had once seemed scattered. She walked carefully, writing with respect, but also with an urgency that made the town lean closer to the paper each week. The younger readers consumed the stories with fascination, marveling at how much could remain hidden in their own streets. The older residents read with a mixture of dread and relief, their secrets finally spoken aloud, but no longer suffocating them. The town meetings, usually sparsely attended, began to fill with people who wanted to share their memories. George sat through more than one of them, listening as elderly men and women stood, their voices breaking as they admitted what they had long suspected. A former town clerk confessed that records had been altered at Colin's request. Documents shifted to cover up inconsistencies around the night of Tom's disappearance. An old fisherman, a contemporary of George's, admitted to seeing Colin's car by the river late that same night, its headlights briefly cutting across the water before vanishing. Each testimony added weight to the truth, no longer conjecture but an accumulation of evidence too heavy to ignore. For Margaret, the process was both healing and agonizing. She attended one of the gatherings, frail yet resolute, clutching the photographs of her brother to her chest as if they were his hands. She spoke only briefly, but her words silenced the room. For 50 years my family waited, never knowing. These pictures gave me back his face, but what they gave me more than that was the knowledge that others remembered too. Tom's story is not mine alone to carry. It belongs to all of us who lived in this town. It belongs to the truth itself. Her tears that followed were not of weakness, but of release. And George, sitting in the back row, felt his own eyes burn. Though Collins himself was long dead, the stories that surfaced about him painted a clear picture of the power he had wielded. Deals in smoke-filled back rooms, pressure applied to lawmen, fear planted in the hearts of ordinary people. No one could say with absolute certainty what had happened to Tom on that final night, but the tapestry of accounts left little doubt that he had been silenced to protect interests greater than his own life. The river had swallowed the camera, perhaps deliberately, but time had failed to erase its contents, and the river, capricious and eternal, had chosen to return it when the silence could no longer endure. George found himself becoming a figure in this story, not merely the man who had pulled the camera from the water, but the keeper of its testimony. Reporters from larger papers arrived, asking to speak with him, wanting to photograph the photographs themselves to write about the fisherman who had dragged history from the river's depths. He answered their questions reluctantly, uncomfortable with the attention, but he did so because he understood it was not about him. It was about Tom, about Margaret, about the town that had lived with a question mark carved into its heart. Late at night, when the noise of the world quieted again, and he sat alone in his house, George often reflected on the chain of events. He thought of that first morning when the net had caught not fish but a rusted shape, heavy with mud and weeds. He thought of how close he had come to discarding it, to tossing it back into the current without another glance. That single decision to keep it had unraveled a silence that endured for half a century. It humbled him, the realization that life could turn on such small choices, how that history could hinge on whether or not an old fisherman decided to lift something from his net. One evening, Margaret invited him to her home. She had gathered her children and grandchildren, introducing George as the man who had given them back a piece of their family. She insisted he sit at her table, eat with them, listen as they shared stories of Tom passed down through the years. For the first time, George felt not like an intruder into another family's sorrow, but like a welcomed guest, a witness whose presence gave meaning to their memories. Margaret's grandchildren, wide-eyed and curious, asked questions about the photographs, about the river, about the town their parents barely remembered as it had been. George answered patiently, his voice steady though his heart swelled with emotion. The final confirmation of what had happened to Tom would never be found. There was no body, no official document that could state the truth plainly, but in the chorus of voices that had once been silent, in the photographs that showed him standing at the edge of ordinary lives, in the memories that had been locked away in fear and now spoken aloud, there was enough to close the chapter. The town acknowledged at last that Thomas Hale had not simply vanished into the night. He had been taken, silenced by a man whose power was greater than justice at the time. The injustice remained, but so too did the recognition, and with recognition came a measure of peace. For George, peace came in quieter ways. He returned to the river each morning, his boat cutting the water as it always had, but now he carried with him the knowledge that even in the stillness of its surface, the river kept secrets it would one day reveal. He fished, he watched the mist rise, he listened to the birds in the reeds, but he no longer felt the same solitude pressing upon him. He knew now that he was connected, not just to the river, but to the lives whose stories he had helped uncover. The town no longer looked past him as the quiet widower who lived alone. They looked to him with respect, with gratitude, as the man who had reminded them that silence could not last forever. On one such morning, as he hauled in his net, George paused, looking at the reflection of the sky on the water's surface. The river moved slowly, indifferent yet eternal, carrying with it the weight of countless untold stories. He felt no need to ask for more. He had been given enough, more than enough. He had learned that the smallest discoveries could carry the heaviest truths, that time could bury but never destroy what was meant to be found. As he rowed back to shore, the sun broke through the clouds, casting light across the water. George smiled faintly, the lines on his face deepening, and for the first time in many years he felt not alone, but whole. The truth had surfaced at last, and though it had come late, it had come nonetheless. Sometimes that was all that mattered. Sometimes justice was not in the punishment, but in the remembering, in the acknowledgement that a man had lived, had mattered, and had been silenced by fear. And now, because of a river, a fisherman, and a camera that refused to forget, that silence was broken forever. If this story kept you watching until the very end, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss what's coming next. We've got even more unbelievable stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Check out the next video on your screen right now. You won't believe what happens there. And if this video shocked you, share it with your friends and family so they can experience it too.